Now there's a particular kind of tired that a man can carry in his body, and then there's the kind he carries somewhere deeper, in the lines of his face, in the hollow behind his eyes, in the way his shoulders slope toward the ground like they've been arguing with the sky for too many years and finally lost. Elias Crow had both kinds, and on that evening, with the sun bleeding low and gold across the western edge of the world, you could have read his whole history just by looking at him. The light caught every crack and crease the trail had carved into his weathered face, and there were many sun scars and windburns, the deep grooves around his mouth that came from squinting against 1,000 dusty horizons, and the fainter lines that came from something else entirely, something he didn't speak of and maybe couldn't. His lips were cracked and parted, dry as the country he'd crossed, and his hazel eyes were fixed on something just ahead of him, out beyond the frame of his own weariness, a light, a small, warm light glowing from a farmhouse window, the kind of light that meant somebody was home, somebody had supper on, somebody had a reason to keep a lamp burning against the gathering dark. He had not meant to stop. He never meant to stop, not anymore. Stopping was for men who had somewhere to be, and Elias had unlearned that habit so long ago he could scarcely remember when he'd last felt the pull of a roof he could call his own. The dust was still settling on his collar from the road behind him, that fine, pale grit that worked its way into everything, the seams of his clothes, the corners of his eyes, the deepest folds of a tired man's heart. He'd been riding since before noon, and walking before that when his horse had thrown a shoe and gone lame on him outside a nothing town with a nothing name. His boots were worn near through. His canteen had run dry around midday, and he'd been too proud or too foolish to ask anybody for a refill. And so here he stood at the edge of dusk, a road-worn shadow of a man, looking at a porch light the way a drowning fellow looks at a distant shore. He told himself it was only the water he wanted. Just water. Just a moment to rest the ache in his legs. Just long enough to ask directions to the next town, and then be on his way again, the way he always was, the way he'd been for more years than he cared to count. A man like Elias didn't believe in arriving anywhere. Arriving was a story for other people, settled people, people who had not learned the hard lesson that the world takes back everything it gives. He had learned that lesson down to the marrow, and yet his feet had carried him off the road and up the wagon track toward that light without his quite deciding they should, the way a tired animal will turn toward the smell of hay. He stood at the bottom of the rise now, hat shadowing his brow, and he looked at that warm window and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't trust. Hope was a dangerous thing for a drifter. Hope got men killed, or worse, got them comfortable, and comfort was just the soft place where the world set its trap. So he stood there, a long moment, swaying a little with exhaustion, and he told himself again, only water, only a night. And then the road, only the road, the way it had always been. But the light kept burning, soft and steady and golden, and somewhere inside the worn-out cathedral of his ribs, a quiet voice he'd silenced years ago stirred and whispered something he could not yet hear. She had heard the dog before she heard the man. Old Buck rising up from the porch boards with that low, rolling warning in his chest that he saved for strangers. And so by the time Elias's boots found the bottom of the rise, Maren was already standing in the doorway with the kerosene glow spilling warm and amber around the dark shape of her. She did not come out all at once. That was not her way, and it had not been her way for a long time now, not since the fever had come through 2 winters back and taken her husband Tom in the space of 9 terrible days and left her alone on 160 acres of grass and wind with nobody to help her work it and nobody to talk to in the long blue evenings but the animals and the ghost. A woman alone learns caution the way a body learns to favor a wounded leg, without meaning to, without thinking, simply because the world has taught her she must. So she stood in the frame of her own front door with one hand resting light against the wood and the other near the faded quilt that hung folded over the rail. The quilt her mother had pieced before Maren was born, and she looked down at the stranger in her yard with eyes the color of storm clouds, dark gray and steady, eyes that had seen too much grief to be frightened easily and too much hardship to be welcoming without good cause. She measured him. That's the only word for it. She read him the way she read the sky each morning to know whether to risk the wash on the line. Plainly, practically, looking for the signs that told the truth beneath the surface. She saw the dust on him, and the dust told her he'd come a long way. She saw the worn boots and the hollow cheeks and the way he held himself, swaying just slightly, and those things told her he was hungry and bone-tired, and probably honest, because a man with bad intentions usually had the strength to stand up straight. She saw, too, the empty look in his hazel eyes when they lifted to find hers. That particular emptiness she recognized because she had worn it herself in the months after Tom went into the ground. The look of somebody who has stopped expecting the world to be kind. She knew that look. She knew it the way you know your own face in a clouded mirror. And something in her, some small, stubborn ember that the grief had not quite managed to smother, leaned toward it. She did not smile. She would not have known how. Not then. Not for a stranger in the dark. But neither did she reach back for the rifle that stood just inside the door, and that for Maren Hollis was its own kind of welcome. The wind came up off the grassland, and lifted the edge of the quilt, and stirred a loose strand of her copper auburn hair across her cheek, and she did not brush it away. She just stood there, framed in light, with the warmth of the house at her back and the cool of the evening at her face, taking the measure of this worn-down ghost of a man who had wandered up out of the dusk into her quiet, careful life. Down in the yard, the drifter took off his hat, took it right off, and held it against his chest, the way a man does in church or at a graveside, and that small courtesy told her more than any words could have. Bad men did not bare their heads. She let the silence stretch a moment longer, the dog still grumbling low beside her, and then she stepped forward into the doorway's edge, into the place where the lamplight and the dusk met, and she made her decision. She came down the porch steps slow, and Elias watched her come the way you'd watch a deer step out of the tree line, careful not to move, careful not to break whatever fragile spell was holding the moment together. He'd had doors shut on him before, plenty of them. He'd had dogs set loose, and shotguns leveled, and hard words flung at his back, and he'd come to expect that of the world, and to bear it without complaint, because a drifter learns that he is, to most folks, less a man than a kind of weather, something that blows through. So he stood there, at the bottom of the steps, with his battered hat clutched in both his weathered hands, turning it slow by the brim, the way nervous men do, and he prepared himself for the closing of the door. He had his "thank you kindly" already loaded and ready, the polite retreat he always kept handy, the words that let a person off easy for turning him away, but the door did not close. Instead, the woman came down toward him until they stood near level, her on the second step, and him in the yard, close enough now that he could see her face plain in the spill of the lamplight, the freckles scattered across her nose, the firm set of her mouth, the gray eyes that had not yet decided what to make of him but had decided, at least, to hear him out. And then she spoke, and the words she chose were not the words he was braced for. She did not ask him what he wanted. She did not ask him where he was headed, or warn him there was no work to be had, or tell him the next town was 8 miles east. She looked up at him, this stranger, this dusty, broken-down piece of the road, and what she asked him, soft and quiet as the dusk itself, was whether he had rested. And they landed on Elias Crow, like rain on cracked ground. For a moment, he could not answer her at all. He stood there, with his mouth half open and his hat going still in his hands, caught so completely off his guard that the careful armor he'd spent years building around himself simply had nowhere to point. Nobody asked a drifter. Nobody. They asked if he could pay, if he could work, if he'd move along. But nobody in all his wandering years had ever stood before him and asked with genuine wanting to know in their voice whether he had found any rest in this hard world. It was the kind of question you asked someone you cared about. It was the kind of question Tom Hollis's mother might have asked her boy when he came in from a long day, the kind of question that assumed, underneath it, that a person mattered, that a person's weariness was worth the noticing. And Elias, who had not been noticed by anybody in a very long time, felt something crack open in his chest. Some old sealed door he'd forgotten was even there. He swallowed hard. His eyes burned a little, and he blinked against it, and looked down at his hat, and was glad of the dusk for hiding his face. No, he wanted to say. No, ma'am, I don't believe I have. Not in years. Not since I can rightly remember. But what came out instead, rough and quiet, was just a simple no ma'am, not lately. Between them, on the porch rail, sat a tin cup, plain and dented and empty, catching a little gleam of lamplight along its lip. And Maren glanced at it, and then back at him, and something in her face had gone gentle around the edges. The stillness held, the grassland breathed around them, and Elias understood, dimly, that he had walked up out of the dark into something he did not have a map for. She did not say anything more right away. She turned instead and went back up the steps, and Elias heard the soft creak of the screen door and the small, homely sounds of a kitchen behind it, the clink of a dipper against a crock, the hiss of something on the stove being moved off the heat. He stood in the yard and did not know whether to follow or wait or simply melt back into the dark the way he was accustomed to doing. And so he waited, because his legs were too tired to carry him anywhere, and because some part of him, some traitor part he didn't trust, wanted very badly to see what she would do next. When she came back out, she had the tin cup in her hand, and it was no longer empty. She came to the edge of the porch and held it out to him over the rail, and the steam rose up off it into the cold evening air in a thin, curling ribbon, catching the amber lamplight as it climbed. It was coffee. He could smell it now. Real coffee, hot and dark and bittersweet. The smell of it reaching down into him and waking up a hunger he had not let himself feel. Her hand was freckled across the back, work-roughened but not unkind, and on her finger a silver ring caught the light and held it, and Elias's gaze snagged on that ring for just a moment because he understood what it meant. A widow's ring, a ring kept on after the man who gave it was gone, a small, bright, stubborn act of remembering. She held the cup out steady and waited, and he had to reach up to take it. had to let his fingers brush the warm tin where her fingers had been, and the warmth of it traveled up through his cold, cracked hands and into his arms. It was such a small thing. A cup of coffee handed to a stranger at dusk. The kind of gesture that cost almost nothing. A handful of grounds, a little water, a moment's trouble. And yet, to Elias Crow, in that hour, it was nearly more than he could bear because it was given freely. Given without his having earned it or asked for it or proved himself worthy of it. Given simply because he was a tired man and she was a person who had once been tired herself and had not forgotten what kindness felt like when you'd given up hoping for it. He wrapped both his hands around the cup the way a man holds something precious, the way you'd cup a small flame against the wind, and he ducked his head and said, "Thank you, ma'am." And his voice came out so rough and quiet, he barely recognized it as his own. She nodded once, a short economical nod, and told him he could sit on the steps if he liked, that there was no sense drinking it standing up after a day like he'd plainly had. And so he sat. He lowered himself down onto the worn gray boards of the porch steps with a groan he couldn't quite swallow, and he held the hot tin cup between his palms and let the steam rise up against his face. And for the first time in longer than he could rightly say, Elias Crow was not on his way to anywhere. He was simply here, sitting on a stranger's porch step in the falling dark, with the warm weight of a kindness in his hands. The dog, old Buck, came over after a while and sniffed at his boots, and then, finding nothing worth objecting to, settled down heavily against his leg with a sigh, and Elias reached down without thinking and laid one hand on that warm, broad back. While inside the lamplit house, a widow moved quietly about her evening, and the great purple dome of the prairie sky pricked out one by one with the cold white fire of its stars. He meant to be gone by first light. That was the agreement he made with himself sometime in the small hours of that night, lying in the soft hay of Maren Hollis's lean-to barn under a horse blanket she'd brought out to him without a word, listening to the wind work its long lonesome song through the grass and the soft stamping of her milk cow shifting in the dark. One night, she had offered him the hay and the blanket, the way she'd offered the coffee, plainly without making a fuss of it, and he had been too worn down to refuse, and so he'd slept, actually slept, deep and dreamless and whole, the kind of sleep that a body on the run never quite lets itself fall into. He woke before dawn, out of long habit, in that gray hour when the world holds its breath between night and day, and he gathered his few things in the dark, meaning to slip away clean, to leave no trouble behind him and take none with him, to be a half-mile down the road before she ever rose to find him gone. That was the kindest thing a drifter could do, he'd always figured, to not make a person say goodbye, to not make them feel they owed him anything or had to send him off with food or worry. But when he came out of the barn into the cold, clean air, the sky to the east was just beginning to bleed from black to deep blue to the first faint promise of rose, and the great sweep of amber grassland rolled away from the homestead toward that brightening horizon, so wide and so still that it stopped him where he stood. And on the porch rail he saw the tin cup, washed and set out, and beside it the faded quilt, folded neat. She had set them out for him. Sometime in the night or the early dark she had come out and left the cup there for him to find, and the quilt folded on the top step where a man might sit, and the small kindness of it rooted his feet to the ground. He could not just walk off into the dawn now. Not after that. So he climbed the steps quiet as he could, and he sat down on the folded quilt, and he took up the cup, and found by some witchcraft of a thoughtful woman that there was coffee already in it, still faintly warm, set there fresh, He held it in both his hands and he looked out over the waking land, over the long amber miles catching the first gold of the rising sun, over the dew silvering the grass and the mist lifting off the low places, and something in him that had been clenched tight for a very long time loosened by some small degree. His duster hung over the rail beside him where he'd draped it. He looked at it. A drifter's coat, road-stained and trail-worn, the coat he had pulled on every morning of his wandering life, and shrugged into like a second skin, the coat that said, "Clear as anything, I am only passing through." And he made no move to put it on. He just sat there in his shirt sleeves, with the cool morning on his arms and the warm cup in his hands, and his eyes soft and far away over the grass. He heard the screen door behind him after a while, and Maren's quiet footfall on the boards, and she did not say anything, and neither did he. And she came and stood at the rail a little ways off with her own cup. And the two of them watched the morning break together over that great golden country in a silence that was not empty at all, but full of all the things neither of them was ready to say, full of the strange, unlooked-for peace of two solitary people sharing a sunrise. But the sun was up now, and the coffee was warm, and the road, for once, did not seem to be calling. There was a length of split-rail fence along the east edge of the kitchen garden that had come loose at the post, leaning drunken into the dirt. And Elias noticed it, the way a working man notices such things, not as a chore that belonged to somebody else. He had not meant to stay past breakfast. But after the eggs Maren fried up for him, and the thick slabs of bread, and the second cup of coffee he hadn't asked for and hadn't been able to refuse, he'd wandered out into the yard to stretch his legs before he hit the trail, and his eyes had fallen on that leaning fence and the post that had heaved up out of the ground, and his hands had started itching the way a craftsman's hands do at the sight of something broken. He found the spade leaning in the open barn, a good old tool with a smooth wood handle worn dark and glossy by years of somebody's palms, Tom Hollis's palms. He understood, though he didn't dwell on it, and he carried it out to the fence line without quite deciding to, the way he'd done so many things since walking up out of that dusk. He pushed his hat back off his brow and spat in his hands and set the blade against the dry autumn earth, and he drove it down with the flat of his boot, and the dirt broke open under it with a good clean sound, that satisfying give of soil parting for honest work. It felt good. Lord, it felt good. He'd done 1,000 kinds of labor in his wandering years, busted broncs and dug graves, and laid track and dragged freight, but it had all been the rootless work of a man passing through, work done for wages. This was different. This was mending. This was setting right something that had gone wrong on a place where somebody lived, and the difference between the two went deeper into a man than he'd have guessed. He worked the post free and tamped fresh earth around it, and dug the spade in again and again, his forearms flexing, his shirt going dark with sweat across the back despite the autumn chill, his jaw. The sun climbed and warmed the back of his neck. Old Buck came out and lay in the dirt nearby and watched him with the lazy interest of a creature who has decided you belong. And somewhere in the steady rhythm of it, dig, lift, tamp, dig, lift, tamp, Elias Crow quietly traded one promise for another he had told himself one night. Now, with the spade in his hands, and the good earth breaking open, and the homestead spread out warm and lived in around him, he told himself only one more day. Just the day. Long enough to set this fence to rights, because it wasn't decent to leave a job half done, and maybe to look at that barn door that hung crooked on its hinge, and the loose board he'd noticed on the porch steps, and the woodpile that wanted splitting before the hard cold came. Just the things that wanted doing. He'd be no trouble. He'd ask for nothing but the hay to sleep in, and maybe a meal, and he'd earn that and more, and then he'd go. That was the bargain he made, leaning on the spade with the sweat cooling on his back and the whole bright morning humming around him. But a man who has been alone a long time does not always know his own heart, and Elias did not yet understand that he was not really mending a fence at all. He was without a single word of it spoken aloud, beginning the slow, careful work of building himself a reason to stay, driving it down post by post into ground he had not yet let himself believe could hold him. Maren watched him from the well. She had gone out to draw water for the wash and found herself halfway through, simply standing there with the rope slack in her hands and her eyes drawn down the slope of the yard to where the stranger worked the fence line. She had not meant to watch him. A widow learns to keep her eyes on her own labors and her thoughts on her own troubles, because the watching of a man can lead a heart down roads it has no business traveling. But there was something in the sight of him that held her, the steady patient rhythm of his work, the careful way he tamped the earth, and tested the post and tamped it again, not rushing, not slacking, but giving it the full measure of his attention, the way Tom used to give a job his full measure, the way good men did. It had been a long time since she'd watched a man work her land, 2 winters and more. And she had not known, until this very moment, how deeply she had missed it. Not the labor saved, though heaven knew she could use the help, but the simple human comfort of another soul moving with purpose across the same patch of earth she called home, the sound of work that wasn't hers, the company of effort. Her face, caught in 3/4 to the morning sun, had changed in some way she could not have named and would not have admitted to. The grief was still there. The grief would always be there. She had made her peace with that long ago, had folded it up and put it away somewhere inside her like the quilt on the rail, always present, always hers. But over the top of the grief, just barely, something else had begun to stir. A tentative thing, a frightened, hopeful, warming thing. The feeling of a door she had bricked up and abandoned showing, suddenly a thread of light around its edges. She watched him push his hat back and wipe his brow with his forearm, and she watched the line of his shoulders against the amber grass, and the wind came up off the prairie and lifted a loose strand of her copper auburn hair and laid it across her cheek, and she let it lie there. She was afraid of what she was feeling. She would not have called it by its name, even alone in the dark. She had loved one man with the whole of her heart, and the world had taken him from her in 9 cruel days and left her hollowed out and howling. And a woman does not hand a wound like that to a second man, lightly does not offer up that tender ruined place to be broke open again by some drifter, who would surely move on the way. Drifters always did. The way the whole wide world was always moving on and leaving her standing still. He would go. She told herself that firmly, holding the rope, watching him work. He would fix his fence and split his wood, and then one morning she would come out and the hay would be empty, and the road would have him again, and that would be that, and she would be glad of the help he'd given, and she would not let it cost her anything more than that. That was the sensible thing to feel. That was the safe and reasonable thing for a careful widow to feel. But her heart, the stubborn fool, would not be lectured. Her heart watched the man set her fence to rights in the golden autumn light, and it whispered something soft and dangerous and warm, and Maren stood at her well, with the rope going slack in her hands, and tears standing unaccountable in her storm-gray eyes, and she let them stand there, and she did not wipe them away. And she watched him work until the wash-water in the bucket below went still as glass, and the morning leaned over slow toward noon. It became their habit, in the days that followed, to meet at the well. Not by any arrangement, not by anything either of them ever spoke out loud. It simply happened, the way the best things between two careful people happen, slow and sideways. She would come out to draw water, and he would happen to be near, mending something or carrying something. And he would set down whatever he held and come over and take the rope from her hands, because it was no work at all for his arms and a real labor for hers. And she let him, and that small letting was its own quiet milestone. So now they stood together at the stone well in the late gold of an autumn afternoon, the two of them, shoulders nearly touching, while he hauled the dripping bucket up hand over hand from the cool dark below, and she stood close beside him waiting to take it. Neither one of them spoke. There was no need. The silence between them had changed in the days they'd shared. It was no longer the wary, measuring silence of strangers, nor the polite, empty silence of folks with nothing to say, but a full and easy silence, the silence of two people who had begun. The bucket came up brimming, and he swung it over to the lip of the well, and she reached for it the same moment he set it down, and their hands met for an instant on the cold, wet wood of the rim, and neither of them pulled away as quick as they might have. The wide amber horizon stretched out behind them, the great burnt gold plains rolling away to the edge of the seeing world, and the sun hung low and warm, and turned the whole country to honey. Elias had been to a great many places in his wandering life. He had stood on mountain-tops and crossed deserts and watched the sun go down over more lonesome miles than he could number. And in all of it, in all those grand and terrible and beautiful empty places, he had never once felt what he felt standing at that ordinary stone well, beside that ordinary remarkable woman. Exactly where he was, with no part of him straining toward the next horizon. It frightened him some. He'd be a liar to say it didn't. A man teaches himself not to want things after enough years of the world taking what he wants, and Elias had grown so skilled at the not wanting that this sudden flood of want left him unsteady, like a man who's gone too long without water. He wanted to stay. There it was, plain as the prairie. He wanted to haul this water every afternoon of his life. He wanted to stand at this well in this light beside this woman until they were both old and gray, and the homestead had gone soft and silver around them. And he did not know how to say so. This rough, unlettered man did not have the words for so large a wanting, and so he said nothing at all, and she said nothing, and the moment stretched out long and golden and aching, that both of them were holding on to with everything they had, and pretending all the while they were only drawing water. The bucket dripped. The wind moved soft through the grass. Old Buck dozed in the warm dust by the porch. And the two of them stood there at the heart of the wide world, shoulder to shoulder, and let the afternoon pour itself out, slow as honey around them, while somewhere underneath all that lovely silence, two long, lonely hearts were quietly, carefully learning each other's shape. There came a morning, and neither of them could have. The seasons turned over that little homestead on the wide amber plains, the way seasons do, and the drifter, who had stopped for a single night's rest, never did find a reason to leave. There was always one more thing that wanted mending. One more fence, one more season of planting, One more hard winter to see her through, and then, well, you couldn't very well leave a body alone come spring, and by then the garden needed turning, and on it went, the small, honest reasons stacking up like cordwood, each one of them true, which was simply this, that he was home, and he knew it, and a man does not leave home. They sat together now on the porch in the gold light of evening, Maren and Elias, side by side on the sagging boards in 2 chairs worn to fit them, with a tin cup set on the rail between them, the same dented cup, perhaps, that she'd handed him steaming through the dusk on that first far-off night, or perhaps another just like it. The vast burnt-orange plains rolled away ahead of them toward the sinking sun, glowing like the inside of a banked fire. The grass all turned to copper, and the sky to flame, the great wide country breathing out the warmth of the day. And here is the thing you'd notice if you were lucky enough to come up that wagon track and see them sitting there. Neither one of them looked at that horizon the way a drifter looks at a horizon. Elias had spent the better part of his life staring at the far edge of the world the way a hungry man stares at a locked larder, with longing, with restlessness, with the endless aching question of what lay beyond and whether it might at last be better than the hard place he stood. Not anymore. Now when his hazel eyes went out across the burning plains, they went out gentle and easy, the way a man looks at a thing he loves and need not chase, because the looking is enough, because he is exactly where he wants to be, and the horizon is just the beautiful far wall of the room he has chosen to live in. And Maren, beside him, looked out at the same fire-gold distance with the same easy peace. The grief in her finally folded all the way down, small and quiet room made beside it. At last, for this, for the warm shoulder near her own, for the slow companionable silence, for the simple wealth of not being alone in the falling dark. She reached over without looking, and laid her freckled hand on his weathered one, where it rested on the chair arm, the silver ring catching the last of the light, and he turned his hand over under hers. And the two of them sat there hand in hand and watched the sun go down over the only country either of them would ever want again. The dog slept at their feet. The first star pricked out cold and white in the deepening blue above the dying fire of the west. Somewhere in the barn the cow shifted, and the chickens settled, and the homestead breathed its evening breath. And a tin cup sat on the rail between 2 people who had each, in their own long, lonesome way, been searching the whole of their lives for exactly this, and had near given up the searching. A man who had stopped for one night's rest, and a woman who had asked him, gentle as the dusk, whether he had rested. He had. At last, after all the dust and all the miles, the road had set him down somewhere worth staying, and Elias Crow had finally, fully rested, and would rest now all the days of his life, here at the end of the dusty trail, here in the gold of the evening, here at home. And that, friends, is the whole of the story. Pull your collar up against the night now, and ride easy. The fire's burning low, and there's coffee on, and somewhere out on the wide and quiet plains, the lamp in the window is still lit, and it is lit for you.